another Bright News podcast. My name is Shannon and I have here today Vicky. So without further ado, Vicky, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Doing okay. Well, just for starters, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you started off, like your career and everything?
Yes, of course. And well, thank you first of all for having me here today. It's such a pleasure to be talking to you.
Thank you.
So yes, my name is Vicky Almansa-Villatoro, and I am an Egyptologist. I finished my PhD in Egyptology at Brown University almost 1 year ago, May 2022. And I am now at Harvard, where I am a junior fellow at the Society of Fellows. And I work on Egyptian language, communication, power display by the king and hierarchy. And I use politeness and discourse analysis mainly in my research.
Great. Well, hopefully we can get into some of that today. But for starters, the first question I want to ask was about, of course, Afro-Asiatic languages. And I know that just from kind of my love for languages and linguistics, I know that ancient Egyptian belongs to the Afro-Asiatic language family, or maybe they don't. We'll find out today. But if you could just maybe tell us about the time depth of the emergence of Afro-Asiatic, do we know that or?
Yeah, well, the first thing you need to know about Afro-Asiatic is that we don't know anything, almost anything for certain. Everything is a hypothesis because precisely of what you're asking now, the time depth of the phylum of this linguistic family is that it is just so old that the history spans for so long because Afro-Asiatic languages are still spoken nowadays. So we are really talking about like millennia of history here. So we don't know exactly when Afro-Asiatic, that is proto-Afro-Asiatic, the original language before all these other languages branched off as different families. So we don't know exactly when proto-Afro-Asiatic was spoken. So we know for sure it must be before the third, fourth millennium BCE, because that's when Egyptian is attested, ancient Egyptian. And for sure, it must be much older than that because you need to give time for the families to diverge and to make to start making differences. So the estimates are roughly as late as 8,000 BCE or as early as 17,000 BCE. And just to give you, a point of comparison, Indo-European, which is the family from which English, Spanish, Russian, all these languages diverged, maybe just as late as 3,000 BCE, 4,000 BCE. It's not clear. So Afro-Asiatic is much older, and that's the reason why we have so many problems studying this family.
Right, and there's no sort of written history or cultural artifacts to sort of explain the time depth for Proto-Afro-Asiatic, is there?
No, exactly. There are, of course, hypotheses of like different cultures that may be associated with, rather than Proto-Afro-Asiatic, with other proto-languages within the family, but with Afro-Asiatic, not really. And written attestations, no way. This is when we say about proto, that means that this is not attested in writing. This is a prehistorical language that has been reconstructed or hypothesized based on the daughters that this language has that are spoken or attested somehow nowadays.
Right. Okay. Now there's another question I'll get to later that I think is tied into this, but since if we don't know the time depth, can we say for certain, say what do they call it? The Uramite, the sort of homeland of Oh, okay. How do you say it?
My German is not great, but I would say Urheimat.
Okay, or Heimat.
Yes.
Mine's not either, so it's okay. The Urheimat or the homeland of Proto-Afro-Asiatic or the Afro-Asiatic language? Has anyone studied that or?
Yes, that's another great question you're asking here. And
Okay.
it's indeed another one that is much debated also.
Okay.
So there are different theories as to where Afroasiatic originated. Like nowadays, Afroasiatic is attested, Afroasiatic languages are spoken in Africa and then also in some parts of Southern Europe and in West Asia. So, but mostly in Africa. So, so a priori, it seems that it must have originated in Africa because that's where the language was, where most of the languages are spoken. But that was actually not, this is actually not what some people think. One of the hypotheses of the origin of Afroasiatic was actually the so-called Levantine hypothesis, that it was spoken in that this original ancestral language was spoken in the area of the Levant. And this was one of the main scholars who proposed this theory is Alexander Militarev. And he was arguing this because he reconstructed dozens of words that are attested in the Afroasiatic languages. So that's how it can be reconstructed that they were spoken also in Proto-Afroasiatic. When you find them attested in different languages in the family, then you can say, okay, so there was a common word that was spoken in this prehistoric language in Proto-Afroasiatic because we have it in all these other daughter languages. So, so he reconstructed dozens of these words that are related with farming terminology. And because of this, he had the hypothesis that the ancestral homeland of Afroasiatic was somewhere in the Levant, precisely where this culture known as the Natufian culture lived. The Natufian culture is associated with the origin of agriculture, and indeed is one of these. They practiced a form of early farming, which is for some people is evidence of incipient agriculture. So that's why they associate they think that these people, of course, knew all this farming terminology, and then when the languages diverged after that, after this original Natufian area, then the languages that were diverging carried also the terminology with them. So another reason why Militarev also thinks that the Natufian culture is the origin of Afroasiatic is because he says that there are many words as well as other morphological items that are shared in common between, especially words, especially vocabs that are in common between Afroasiatic and also Sumerian and North Caucasian, which are not Afroasiatic languages. Sumerian is an isolated language. We don't know any relative of Sumerian. We don't know where it came from.
Right.
So that's evidence for him that they must have been, that this Afroasiatic must have been spoken in this area in the Levant, and that's how all the connections with Sumerian and Caucasian came into place. But this theory has been criticized, of course, because it's as I was saying before, most of the Afroasiatic languages are spoken in Africa, right? So assuming that Afroasiatic appeared in the Levant would presuppose a very convoluted migration scenario, after which, like, all the other people would be diverging in all these other subfamilies in Africa. So this is not the most followed theory nowadays. As I was saying, there are also many others, many other ideas about where the homeland originated. There is also Christopher Ehret, who thinks that the homeland of Afroasiatic was in the area of the Horn of Africa, where nowadays Cushitic languages are spoken. So Christopher Ehret actually had the idea that we have an original Proto-Afroasiatic in the Horn of Africa that then diverges into Proto-Erythrean, which is another branch, another sub-branch in the Afroasiatic family that then goes all the way in the north, and then there it goes into Egyptian, Semitic languages, and it splits like that. And then the first one that will split from the Afroasiatic family, according to Ehret, will be Omotic, which is another family within Afroasiatic, and it's very different from the others. Indeed. it's many authors actually. Well, there is so much disagreement in Afro-Asiatic, but some authors indeed agree that Omotic could be the earliest to split because it's very different from the other Afro-Asiatics. There was some lexico-statistical study done by Fleming that yielded that indeed there are very few proto-Afro-Asiatic retentions in Omotic. So that could be a reason why it's actually split in earlier. Right. And so these are the main theories. It's either in Africa or in the Levant. There was also Carsten Pust who proposed that it was in Africa, but not in the Horn of Africa, but in Egypt. And then from Egypt, it diverged into all these other peripheral areas. And we, me and my colleague, Sylvia Stupnova-Nigrelli, we organized a conference at Brown University in 2018, and we had the idea, well, not the idea, it was more like a provocative question that we wanted to use as a way, just as an excuse to give to people, as an icebreaker for people to start talking to each other. So we wanted to ask whether it was possible that ancient Egyptian, rather than being the daughter of Afroasiatic, was the sister of Proto-Afroasiatic. And that's how we invited scholars who were working on African languages, on Semitic languages, and Egyptian, and we put them to speak to each other in this conference. And then we published the book very recently. It was actually published a month ago, or less than a month ago, Ancient Egyptian Afroasiatic.
Yeah.
The students of the conference.
I mean, so speaking about Egypt, because I know that, there's sort of like, there's genetics that go into this too, like genetic studies where people are trying to kind of figure out, is there some kind of genetic link that they all have in common? And I think one of those genetic markers is what they call R1B13 or something like that, right? And they say like, all the males or something like that have this Y chromosomal similarity to each other. And then from there, I mean, I personally like the emerging out of the Horn of Africa and branching off. And I know, Omotic is one of those earlier ones. And then of course there are others. I mean, there's many, right? Like Cushitic, Berber, the Chadic languages like Hausa, which is like that, right? And then of course you have the Semitic languages, which and then maybe we can talk about this, like how if we say, okay, all the languages emerge, like the proto language emerged out of Africa, but then you have like the Semitic languages like Hebrew and everything, and they're kind of isolated and spoken in the Levant. How did Semitic languages like, say, Amharic or Ge'ez or Tigrinya get into Ethiopia, right? Does that make sense? I guess.
Yes.
It's sort of a, I guess it's sort of a conundrum, right? Like, or Sabaean, right?
Yes. No, that complicates the question even more. It could be also, and there is also the possibility of later migrations as well as unattested branches that were once spoken. This was a theory actually by Gabor Takash of an unattested language, Semitic language that was spoken, for example, in the Levant, and that it's not attested anymore, but that it became extinct, but it was spoken there at some point. So something like that could have happened in Africa as well, an unattested branch of the Semitic language in that area that is not, we don't have evidence of anymore, but it was once spoken. They just didn't leave any writing on it. So there is no way for us to know. And that will explain the missing link as well.
Right. Okay. So speaking in terms of like religious ideas, attached to Afroasiatic, I know your area is more with Egyptian, say, culture and language. So were the Egyptians, okay, I'll put it this way. I read a paper in which Dr. Christopher Eric said something about the proto-Afro-Asiatic speakers were henotheists, right? That's like they, and correct me if I'm wrong if I get the definition for that wrong. Henotheism is sort of this idea that you have your gods, but you accept other people's gods too, right? Okay. Yes. So was ancient Egyptian, like that in the beginning, or did it evolve from that into, say, polytheism? Or
yes, it's difficult to say what Egyptian was in the very beginning, but it's likely that something like that was happening. An enotheistic situation. You do see that in, for example, with the existence of local gods, like people would refer to their local god as the god, as if it's the only one, because at that point that's the one that matters, not the others, even though of course other gods are attested. And you see that also in wisdom literature, which is that's how we in Egyptology refer to this genre of of texts that contains a bit of morals or advice about life and didactic literature in a sense. So in this wisdom text, it is often mentioned the god as if it's only one, just the god, like that. But of course, for somebody as an outsider, you read this and you're like, well, who is the god? The Egyptians had many gods, right? So who are you referring to? And it's again the situation of enotheism, which also happens, for example, is much clearer in later time periods, like in the New Kingdom, in which the god Amun was the most important of all, and then it was referred as the god, and that was the one that mattered, not all the others. And but then, it's difficult to tell how this was in the beginning of the Egyptian religion, also because it is. Well, we don't have, at the time in which we have the first gods attested, we also don't have texts. So it's or we don't have longer texts. So it's more difficult to assess this. But it's likely that enotheism was a thing. But all kinds of religious practices are attested in Egypt. You have monotheism at some point in Egypt too, with the reign of Akhenaton, who started first as an enotheism. He was saying Aton is the main god. But we know that there are other gods too, because they were attested, they were respected, they were left to exist. But at some point, Akhenaton even removed the plural of the word gods from inscriptions. So he said, okay, there is only one god now. Now we are really talking about monotheism, not enotheism. So that happened at some point in Akhenaton's reign too, this change from one to the other.
Right. Okay. Well, let's get to the question of why ancient Egyptian is such a contested language within the Afro-Asiatic language family. I heard you say earlier that it could be perceived as a sister language to Afro-Asiatic rather than a branch or a member of the family. So would that mean that Egyptian belongs to some other language grouping, or
Egyptian belonging to some other language grouping? That's yes. So okay. So the idea of Egyptian being the sister of Afroasiatic would suppose that yes, there was yet another proto-ancestral language that existed before Proto-Afroasiatic, and that was the mother of both Egyptian and Proto-Egyptian and Proto-Afroasiatic, and then those develop. Proto-Afroasiatic continues with its own families, and Proto-Egyptian develops into ancient Egyptian, and so on. That was the hypothesis that we proposed for the workshop, and those, as I said, it was more like a way to start a conversation, because there is no really way to prove such a thing, and not all of the speakers and the authors of the book addressed this question specifically, but those who did seem to agree that the evidence is consistent with Egyptian being part of Afroasiatic as one more family within the family. So the problem with Egyptian is that for Semitic, for example, we have other languages, right? We have Hebrew, we have Arabic, so we have so many other Semitic languages that can be used to reconstruct Proto-Semitic, their common ancestor. With Egyptian, we only have Egyptian. Ancient Egyptian is an isolated language within its family. Okay. So it's more problematic. And the problem with Egyptian also is that it's very different from other languages in the family. In particular, it doesn't have the prefix conjugation that is so common in languages like Semitic languages or in Berber or in Cushitic, but it's not attested in Egyptian. So okay. That's one of the problems. So it could be that this prefix conjugation existed in Proto-Afro-Asiatic and it was lost in Egyptian, or it could be that the others merged together and developed it independently of Egyptian. Okay. And so this is. Mm-hmm.
Could you give us an example of a prefix conjugation? Because I don't know what that means, and I'm pretty sure people who listen to this probably won't know what that means either. Maybe they do. Maybe I'm assuming too much, but yeah.
Yes. So it's for example, in Semitic languages, you would have a prefix conjugation, which is basically Y and then some other vowel or change in front of the verb, which is the way to form the paradigm of the verb. Yes, that the conjugation of the verb is made by a prefix, whilst in Egyptian is made with a suffix at the end of the verb.
Okay, so you spoke about Sumerian, right? Being an isolated language. Now, I remember when I was in junior college, there used to be this, kind of debate and about whether Sumerian or ancient Egyptian was like the oldest written language. And, they would say, well, the beginning of civilization began in Mesopotamia with the Sumerians, and, the Akkadians or the Babylonians, I can't remember, picked up the Sumerian cuneiform, right? And then you had other scholars who say, no, ancient Egyptian is the oldest written language. And I would always say, well, as a joke, I would say, well, it doesn't really matter because the one that survived is ancient Egyptian through other written languages, right? Like, but anyways, that was a joke. But can we say that ancient Egyptian is the oldest written language, or
Sumerian is oldest than ancient Egyptian? Unfortunately, we have to give them that. Sumerian was attested before, but I think, well, at least in my opinion, the longest we have the longest Egyptian texts, which are most interesting grammatically. Okay, so long texts that are more interesting grammatically are from Egypt, are the pyramid texts, in my opinion. Okay. Whilst in the early Sumerian texts are mainly, as far as I know, because I'm not an expert on this, but as far as maybe there are other texts that I don't know, but they're mostly lists and lists, titles, names, these sort of things. So it's so in that case, I think Egyptian is probably has their texts. Their first texts are later than Sumerian, but then you get to long, interesting corpus earlier than Sumerian.
Okay, so it's like you get more complicated writing system, I guess, than Sumerian over time. Then, yeah. Okay.
Yes, and then attested language, like texts that are written.
Right.
The writing systems are used to two different things there. So Sumerian uses logograms, Egyptian uses hieroglyphs, but yes.
Right. And how, and I mean, okay, can you say something about how hieroglyphs may have began? I mean, obviously, I mean, they would be called what, like pictograms, something like that. I mean, they're images of what they're seeing in the world. And then I'll let you explain it if you can. Yeah.
How ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs appeared.
Yeah.
So the earliest texts that we have from Egypt are probably attested in probably already in seals that come from the early dynastic, or in stele, which are basically stone slabs that contain short inscriptions in there. And those are written in hieroglyphs, yes, because hieroglyphs is not the only writing system that the Egyptians knew. They also knew hieratic, which is sort of like a cursive hieroglyph. Not exactly, but it's basically hieroglyphs written fast. And they almost don't look like hieroglyphs anymore. So yes, the earliest texts are written in hieroglyphs, and in many cases we don't know for certain if the meaning is the same as the one that we have later on. In some cases the signs change, but yes, what was their origin? It's difficult to tell, but not all hieroglyphs represent actual ideas, which is what we call an ideogram. Some hieroglyphs also represent sounds, which are phonograms. So you have a mix of both. But in any case, they're always pictorial. Like they may not mean ideas, but they represent the image of something. So then you can have this same image can represent either an idea or a sound, depending on how it is used. So this is how the hieroglyphic system works in Egyptian. Then you have another kind of sign, which is called determinative or classifier, which is put at the end of a word, and it usually this designates the word within a specific semantic field. So these are the uses of hieroglyphs. So yes, this is a pictorial kind of writing, but not always ideographic, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, right. They don't always carry an idea. Sometimes
yes, sometimes they just mean sounds.
Right. Okay.
Like the alphabet. Yes.
Right. And so that leads me to my next question, and that this is where my joke came in, about ancient Egyptian being sort of the parent writing system for all the other, for most of every language we have today, right? So we can say, Greek, Phoenician, Latin, which then English took on, I guess, and other Germanic languages. But then even, the Brahmic script in India, and the Khmer language in Cambodia, and Thailand, and Indonesia. All these languages. So it would be interesting to know how ancient Egyptian sort of was carried off into these far-flung places that are so distant from it.
So your question is how ancient Egyptian was. So, but what do you mean was taken to other far places?
Like how were they able to sort of take, I guess, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics and turn them into something like say ancient Phoenician and ancient Persian,
I get your question. Yes, I get your question now. Sorry. Okay, so this is usually this theory is the one that assumes that the alphabet derives from the protostinoetic script, which are those inscriptions that are found in the area of the Sinai, or in Egypt mainly, that are basically alphabetic, which is different than the hieroglyphic system, as I was explaining before. An alphabetic system is just a manageable number of signs that represent sounds and that people can easily learn and use to compose words. So these inscriptions that are attested in the Sinai, these proto-Sinaitic inscriptions, are written in an alphabetic kind of script, which derives from the hieroglyphs. So for example, you will have the word for house, which is per in Egyptian. It's and they whoever was writing this took the hieroglyph of the house, which represents sort of like a house, the plan of a house, and then just took it to represent the first letter of the Semitic word for house, which is bait. So the first letter is B. So then the sign for the house represents B. In this protostinoetic script, but not in Egyptian. In hieroglyphs, the house will be something else, as I was saying, will be the house. So the hypothesis is that people who were working perhaps in the area of the mines in the Sinai in Egypt were people who were speaking Northwest Semitic language. And then these people would have used hieroglyphs, and then they would have combined this with the meaning of in their own language, and that's how they created this script. So then these people would then take this writing also with them, and because they were not Egyptians, they were people who were probably Canaanites from the area of Canaan. Then it will be more of a mobile sort of like kind of writing that will be attested also outside of Egypt. And that way, this alphabet, the hypothesis is that it may have derived into the Phoenician alphabet, which then became the ancestor of the Greek alphabet, which is then the ancestor of the alphabets that are in use nowadays in Europe, in the US,
right, just about everywhere. Yeah. That and that's a very interesting question. I've always kind of been sort of fascinated by that. Like, you can think of all these languages that sort of have their writing system derives from that in some, in a very complicated way, right?
The migration of people who take the script with them, and it's a multicultural contact.
Right. Wow.
That's how technology happens. It's just a matter of exchanging ideas.
Yes. Yeah. So we have early technology right there.
Yes. And it's a very important one also.
Right.
One that we use every day.
Yes. Right. Okay. So with that, can we, since we've gone into talking about Phoenician and Canaanite, can we talk about the Natufians and Proto-Semitic a little more? If you can you explain sort of what the Natufian culture is, and where they fit into this sort of proto-Afro-Asiatic or Afro-Asiatic and Semitic grouping?
Right. So these people, the Natufians, they were probably like herder, a gatherer. I'm blanking on the word now. They were hunter-gatherers.
Hunter-gatherers. Okay.
Sorry, hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers, and they practiced a form of early agriculture or early farming. They were acquainted with farming, and they existed at some point, probably around 10,000 BCE, in the area of the Levant. And we have, there is like a material culture associated with these people in there. Of course, there is no written text, but there is all this. There is the material evidence of them. So the hypothesis was that because we have all these words attested with farming in Afro-Asiatic languages, and especially considering that in many Afro-Asiatic cultures, like ancient Egypt, agriculture was developed much later in time. The hypothesis is that these words existed in the language before the family diverged, before the family split. So then this takes us to the people who were practicing agriculture or like some form of farming earlier, which is the Natufians. So that was why Alexander Militarev hypothesized that was the origin of the Afro-Asiatic, and the area where the Levant, which is where these people were living, will be the homeland of Afro-Asiatic, and then people would migrate in other areas.
Okay. And so like just to like so the Levant, right? I mean, I know that's like today's, that'd be like Palestine / Israel, and then like Lebanon. Okay.
That area to the east of Egypt, that extends this strip of land along the coast. That's the strips vertically. from so to the east, towards the east of Egypt. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So I guess my next question would be Afro-Asiatic languages and their contact with other uh, uh, language families. So like, it's contact with Indo-European. And then I know there was contact with, what do you call it? Nilo-Saharan? Is that the right term?
Nilo-Saharan, yes.
Right.
Yes.
And then also the Niger-Congo speaking
Yes.
peoples in West Africa. So can you just maybe give us a little example of how that, maybe how something like that would have developed these other languages and these other cultures, right? Like having language contact, of course, would maybe change you would incorporate words into your language that came from other languages, right? And then you would maybe adopt the culture of those groups into your culture as well, or something like that, right?
Yes, yes. Yes, that is a big dilemma in linguistics, whether similarities in two languages are due to contact or to kinship, basically. So how can you tell whether, for example, Egyptian and Semitic are related because are actually related, like they both belong to the same linguistic family because they share similarities? So how can we be sure that these similarities are due, to contact between the families, and rather than to shared retentions from a common ancestral time in which the two were a single spoken language? So that is a problem in linguistics. So it's usually determined looking at, in general, at the broader picture of the language, and as well as like internal patterns of how the language works, and also more general movements of directions of change in linguistics. So if something can be explained because it's a common change, moving from something, for example, that disappears in one language as it diverges from the ancestral language, okay, that's what it is. But these sort of things argue in favor of kinship. But to know, and then of course you have also the sort of words that are more difficult to borrow, like pronouns, for example, or grammatical words. These sort of things. Those are the sort of things that people usually don't borrow from other languages because they usually have them in their own language, so there is no need to borrow. So if you have languages that have similar grammar, that probably means that they are related, rather than that there was a contact between the languages and that changed. But for example, words for technology are very commonly borrowed. Like for example, in Italian, they don't have a word for computer; they use the English word computer. So that's because it's a word for technology. So they just use whatever they just use the word as they took it from as it came from English, right? So these sort of things happen. So whenever you have these words, rather than, for example, a word for mouth, then that probably points towards it being contact. So that's the thing with Nilo-Saharan and with Niger-Congo, that they are of course, they share an area in Africa. So there are things, parallels between Egyptian and other languages in other Nilo-Saharan or Niger-Congo languages that could be explained as contact, rather than the all of them sharing kinship. Although it has been proposed as well that they are related at some point. That was the theory, the Pan-Africanist theory by Cheikh Anta Diop, for example, and other people who followed him as well. They argued that there was a common African and ancestral family. So Egyptian would not be Afro-Asiatic, but would be part of this common family. So that's also another theory too.
Wow. Okay. Okay. So I want to ask some more interesting questions, and then I'll leave you alone. I promise.
Oh.
I want to talk about the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And and I know it centers around Osiris, and he's like one of my, as far as like ancient Egyptian, he's one of the more interesting gods to me. I don't know how old he is in terms of, you know, time period as far as religion in ancient Egypt, but
not very old.
okay, wow, okay.
I mean, he's old, but he's not as
Right.
old as others. Yes.
Right. Okay. So then, how far back would say something like the Egyptian Book of the Dead go? And does it? I mean, would it tell you anything about, say, you know, the ancient, maybe something about the proto-ancient Egyptian, maybe religious worldview?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So the Book of the Dead is not the oldest religious. Well, I don't like to call it religious. It's more like a funerary. It's a mortuary. It's not the oldest mortuary corpus in Egypt. The oldest is the pyramid texts, and then after the pyramid text, we have the coffin texts, and then you have the Book of the Dead. So there is a history of evolution. The three share things in common, many aspects in common, but they are three different kinds of texts. But so in that respect, if you're able to trace back the oldest traditions, the things that appear in the Book of the Dead that are also attested in the earlier texts, then you may be able to tell to reconstruct at least what sort of beliefs and practices are continuous and more resistant to change and had remained, from the beginning, from the Old Kingdom, which is when we have the pyramid text, until the second intermediate period, which is when the Book of the Dead appears. So in that sense, yes, but pre-Egyptian, proto-Egyptian is much older than that in any case. So it's difficult to or I would say it's impossible to actually tell for sure what how the beliefs, how the Book of the Dead or the pyramid text connect with earlier traditions. Although one could look also at the iconography, what appears in, for example, in pottery from the pre-dynastic, if one assumes that that's the time in which pre-Egyptian or proto-Egyptian was spoken. You have some, but it's, then you get into also the problem of like you assume that thing just because something looks similar to what comes later is the same thing, which is also problematic. So that's the thing. I will say, without having text, it's difficult to assess religious beliefs or these sort of things, in my opinion.
Right. Okay. And then the next one would be the whole idea of Egypt having originally like a north and a south, right? And of course,
you mean the
like
upper Egypt and lower Egypt.
Yeah, upper Egypt and lower Egypt, right? And then upper Egypt is the south, and lower Egypt is the north, right? And then they had two crowns, right? They have the white crown and the red crown, and then on top of that, and then there's one more thing I want to say with that is these two, I guess, female deities called Nekhbet and Wadjet.
Yes.
Am I getting that right?
Nekhbet and Wadjet, yes.
Okay. How important are Nekhbet and Wadjet and the white crown and the red crown and the sort of separation, originally the upper and lower Egypt and then finally their unification? I mean, are we talking about like different tribes that kind of, something like that come under one ruler, or?
Okay, so let me see if I understood your question. You're asking if we are certain that the crowns and the goddesses associate with Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, and then they all merge at the time of the unification, right?
Yes.
Is that the question?
Yeah, yes. Right.
Okay. Yes. Yes, so that's an awesome question. And my answer is that I cannot be certain. It's sort of assumed that that's probably what it meant at the time, at least, in which we have the Narmer palette, which is the earliest representation of a pharaoh wearing the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt at the same time. So at that point, it seems that at least Upper and Lower Egypt were associated with, Upper Egypt with the white crown and Lower Egypt with the red crown, because you have the Narmer palette. Before that, let me tell you that actually the crown of Lower Egypt, which should be the north of Egypt, appears for the first time in the south of Egypt. So that's our earliest attestation. It's in the south, actually. It's in an Akkada pot. And then also the white crown of Upper Egypt appears for the first time in Sudan, in Nubia.
Okay.
So it's, as you say, the situation is complex. It's maybe, as you mentioned before, different groups of people that were associated with the crowns and with the goddesses. It's including, yes, the vulture, Nekhbet, and Wadjet with the cobra. It's difficult to tell whether the signs, as I was saying before, that's again, we fall into the dangers of assuming that because something was true later on, it was also true before. At this time period, when we don't have texts, we don't know many things. And I will say that until the time of Narmer, and maybe not even in the time of Narmer, we cannot be certain that these symbols had a specific geographic association.
Okay. All right. Okay. My last question will be, and I think you wrote a paper on this, and that is on the story of the dispute between man and his Ba.
Oh, yes.
Right? Can you talk a little bit about that story and what that all entails?
Oh, yes, I would love to, because it's my favorite Egyptian story.
Okay.
Yes, this is a story in which somebody, it's written from the point of view of a person who is speaking to his Ba, and the Ba has been translated sometimes as soul, but it's not really the soul. It's another spiritual aspect of a person, but it doesn't correspond one-on-one to the idea of soul. So this person is speaking to the Ba and is having a conversation about whether or not he should commit suicide, pretty much. Now, the text is very ambiguous, so it's not entirely clear what it says. Some people argue that the man is saying that he wants to live, and the Ba is telling him that he should die, and other people say the other way around. So it is confusing. The text can be interpreted both ways if you read the original Egyptian. It's very ambiguous. So it's interesting also because, apart from this idea of suicide, which is, I think, to my knowledge, is the earliest attestation of a text that discusses so openly suicide, or at least the main character wants him to commit suicide. But yes, apart from that, it's also a very skeptical text about the afterlife and afterlife beliefs. The Ba at some point tells him, when he's trying to convince him not to die, it seems, the Ba says, there is no point in you making a tomb for yourself. Look at all these other tombs that other people build. They're all forgotten and abandoned. Like, nobody remembers you anymore. So it's saying, enjoy life on earth while it comes, because basically we don't know what's going to happen afterwards. Right. And so it's a skeptical and presents a negative view of the afterlife, which it's in clashes with our idea of what the Egyptians thought of the afterlife, and of life beyond death, and of the utility, the usefulness of funerary cults, of making a tomb, making mummies, all that. The Ba is basically being skeptical of all these ideas. So it's a very interesting text from this point of view.
Why do all this stuff if you may not go anywhere? You may just die, and that's it, right?
And everybody's going to forget about you, just like we have all these pyramids and all these temples and in the honor of somebody who's dead now, but is now forgotten. Nobody comes anymore to bring offerings. That's what the text is saying. So it's very skeptical. Yeah. And it's completely a message of carpe diem.
Right. Wow.
He literally says, follow the beautiful day, which is carpe diem, pretty much.
Yeah. I somebody used to tell me that's like what do you call it, Epicurean or something like that, like just enjoy life tomorrow we die or something like that. Is that the carpe diem?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
Right.
Yes,
Okay.
that's what it is. From
Wow.
ancient
Wow.
Egypt.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Well, lastly,
Yes.
just to plug your book, your
Oh.
new volume again. I want to make sure I get the title right. It's Ancient Egyptian and Afro-Asiatic,
Mhm.
Rethinking the Origins. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay.
That's
And
it.
that's been out for since March of 2023.
I think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
very recently.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, yes.
Well, thank you so much, Vicky. I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me on a Friday, you know.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
It's been really fun. I hope it was not too confusing with all these branches and
No,
all of this.
no. I got a lot out of it, you know what I mean? So yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Okay, ciao.
Okay, bye.